Notebook 1, Garrison Duty, from August 2nd to November 1st, 1914. In the small village of Peyriac-Minervois, on a hot afternoon on the 2nd of August 1914, Louis Barthas' story began with a drum roll. The people thought that perhaps it was a traveling merchant announcing his wares, or acrobats that were going to present a new show. But it turned out to be the town clerk announcing France's general mobilization as a preparation for war. These news horrified Barthas, but to his astonishment they aroused enthusiasm in the crowd. People were confident that the war would be short and glorious victory certain. Everyone started getting ready in fever pitch, as if they feared not getting to the front in time before victory was achieved. Some of the men even left the village to enlist before their appointed dates. One of the immediate and most extraordinary changes that Barthas witnessed among his countrymen was the apparent disappearance of all previous hatreds. Irreconcilable brothers were suddenly reconciled, mothers-in-law and sons-in-law that exchanged insults the day before now exchanged kisses. Neighbors that did not speak to each other were now engaging in the friendliest of conversations. There were no more political adversaries, no more injuries, offenses or grudges. All was forgotten. In the words of Barthas himself, the first effect of the war was the accomplishment of a miracle: peace, concord, reconciliation among people who hated each other. He wondered whether or not this new fraternal spirit would last. On August 4, it was the third day of mobilization, and about half of the chosen men in Peyriac had to leave. They embarked at the train station accompanied by almost the entire village, which went to say farewell. Everyone showed courage, whether true or false, and only 2 women fainted away at the sight of their sons and husbands leaving. Barthas was also set to depart that same day, but he was recovering from an infection that had attacked his face and almost killed him. He wasn't capable of anything more intense than walking around his bedroom, and leaving and going to the train station was impossible for him. But the gendarmes would hear nothing of it and were making serious threats to him. In the end, Barthas got assistance from the unlikeliest source, his former political enemies. Here I must make a brief side note. As has been mentioned in the previous episode, Barthas was a socialist. Not only that, but he was apparently very politically active. There are several references throughout the book to his participation in municipal elections and writing articles and letters to different socialist groups and publications. So this must be where his references to political enemies come from. Unfortunately, I have not found more information on the subject, but at least this serves to give some context to his statements. But returning to the story. With the wave of excitement brought by the war, his former enemies seemed to have forgotten all grudges from the past and decided to help him, using their connections to eventually talk with and explain the situation to the regional recruitment commander, who in the end said that Barthas could rest, but he had to join up as soon as possible. A few days later, Barthas felt strong enough to make the trip to his designated barracks in the nearby town of Narbonne. He had to join the depot of the 125th Territorial Regiment that had been installed in a former Capuchin monastery. The Capuchin order had been expelled from France in 1903, and now the monastery had been repurposed by the military. It is important to explain what being in a territorial regiment meant. The French army divided its regiments into 4 categories based on the age of its soldiers. Ranging from youngest to oldest, the categories were active, active reserve, territorial, and territorial reserve. Because Barthas was 35 years old at the time the war broke out, he was assigned to the territorials, though in the near future the French army would suffer such devastating casualties that he would be reassigned to the active reserve. But returning to the present, Narbonne was a town full of soldiers in half uniform. People were filled with so much enthusiasm about the war that they had joined up in far greater numbers than the military authorities had expected or prepared for. So there were not enough uniforms, places to billet them, or food to give them. Barthas received an old, torn, and filthy uniform and had to sleep piled with many others inside the confessional booth of the repurposed church. With all these scarcities, many soldiers had to fill up hotels and cafes, having to pay out of their own pockets. And so life continued, and the town showed itself to be brimming with activity. Barthas's entries say that on the 7th of August, the 80th Active Regiment left for the front, followed by the 280th Active Reserve Regiment on the 13th. Also on the night from the 12th to the 13th, the 125th Territorial Regiment left for Morocco. Despite all these departures, the streets were still packed with soldiers. The army had called up all the conscription classes even though it was not ready to receive them, apparently wishing to take advantage of the war enthusiasm that had gripped the people before it faded away. Barthas notes that discipline was not very strict in the first few days, but soon they were subjected to the tyranny of a man called Manival, the commandant of the regimental depots of Narbonne. The soldiers called him the dictator Manival. He confined them to their overcrowded quarters all day long, with nothing to eat except what bad and meager food the army had. At night the doors opened very late and closed immediately at first call, with patrols hunting any and all who were still in town. Manival handed out punishments liberally and subjected the garrison to more little irritants, bothers, and big and petty tyrannies than could be listed. In the end, Barthas simply said that the men seemed to be more suited for running a prison, not free men. But Barthas was aware that the moment they had donned their uniforms, they had stopped being free. They were now soldiers, property of the army. Despite this, there was one individual who constantly and bravely defied Manival's authority. He was a private by the name Assens, but in Narbonne he was known simply by the nickname Fallet. Fallet was picked up by the police almost daily for being drunk on the sidewalk after amusing people with his songs and shows. He spent more nights sobering up in jail than in his barracks bunk, which many soldiers were not even sure existed. The war may have made Fallet a soldier, but a drunk he was and a drunk he remained. This was not helped by the fact that at this time wine was being sold for practically nothing, and was even given out for free to soldiers at the Wine Growers Association. Fallet usually missed roll calls and drills, escaping the convent and going to the city to get his drink, no matter how many sentries Manival posted and how responsible they were made for his whereabouts. Fallet always slipped past them with ease and disappeared. One night Fallet escaped right under the captain's nose, and Barthas and 4 other guards were ordered to pursue him. But Fallet seemed to fly rather than run, and soon lost them. The 5 guards' desperate pursuit only managed to attract a crowd of street urchins that laughed at them. That very night Fallet made an enormous racket in a cafe, and when an officer tried to stop him, Fallet insulted the officer and threatened him with a bayonet. This was a step too far, and Manival wished to have Fallet shot. But the man had earned the sympathy of the population of Narbonne, who saw him as nothing more than a harmless and fun drunk. They protested vehemently and saved him from this macabre fate. Manival, still furious, wrote a public note that denounced Fallet's conduct, calling him a disgrace to the army and the uniform he was wearing, among many other things. Fallet was not fazed, and took this note as a letter of honor, and wore it with pride. He continued creating chaos, and was a frequent guest in the barracks prison. Another side of life in Narbonne that was far less entertaining was the 2 doctors of the reserve units in the Narbonne garrison. Throughout these notebooks one notices a rather distressing pattern in which many doctors are rather cruel, or at least negligent, with the people they are supposed to help, and these 2 doctors are the first examples we'll see. It is important to remember that Barthas had arrived to the Narbonne barracks in a pitiful state of health. He had been ordered to go to Narbonne as soon as he could walk, not as soon as he recovered from the infection that had almost killed him. So in Narbonne he had to go see these doctors. There were many sick men who were waiting in line for medical attention, but the doctors rejected them one after another with barely a glance. By the time it was Barthas's turn, the doctors had already sent off over 100 sick men without any kind of medical help. When Barthas entered, he was immediately rejected despite his state, and the doctors threatened him not to return unless he wanted to suffer serious consequences. The soldier that came immediately after Barthas in line had a festering wound on his stomach. The doctors didn't even examine the wound and told him that it was healing and that he should not return. Barthas and this soldier complained with the mayor of Narbonne, a Dr. Ernest Ferrul, who on a curious side note was the first socialist mayor in France. The mayor was sympathetic to the plight of the soldiers and was enraged by the conduct of the doctors, but he knew that in this time of madness, when everyone had been swept with excitement for the war, his hands were tied and there was nothing he could do against those doctors. Still, the mayor gave them what care he could provide, free of any charge, something that Barthas said he did to all soldiers who came to him for help. Life continued, and soon after, Manival started putting the soldiers through long drill sessions and exercises day and night, exhausting them. The firing range was on a nearby lake, and a detail of 4 men at a corporal had to stand guard day and night to protect the cabin where they kept the shooting targets and also to keep any would-be bullet collectors away from the embankment. Barthas was assigned to this job regularly, and the quiet nature of the assignment, in which they were not bothered by superiors appearing out of nowhere, would have made it rather pleasant, had it not been for the hordes of mosquitoes that appeared as soon as the sun set and harassed them throughout the night. The guards had to constantly light brush fires to keep them away, and the 5 mattresses they had been provided were filthy and infested with ticks and lice. So if the guards weren't so tired as to fall asleep as soon as they laid down on them, then it was impossible to rest at all, because the pests would start biting. The fleas had also infested the barracks and had multiplied extremely quickly. Sometimes it was so unbearable that soldiers had to resort to sleeping outside under the pine trees in the convent's garden, risking a cold or a stiff neck. Another aspect of life in Narbonne at that time that was always full of activity and is worthy of attention was the train station. Among some of the things that could be seen every day were Italian laborers that were returning home and soldiers passing through on their way to the front. Barthas noted the excitement and bravado of those young soldiers. Most of the carts had many insults and threats drawn on them, addressed to the Germans and their Kaiser. Barthas considered that it was shameful that higher-ups would allow for such childishness and obscenity, but there was nothing that he could do about it. An event in the train station that caused a wave of excitement throughout the city was the arrival of the first trainload of wounded from the front. Several hours before the train was scheduled to arrive, the crowds were already waiting and soldiers had been placed around the station. Only stretcher bearers would be allowed to get on the train, so many local big shots and high officials signed up as stretcher bearers for the prestige that this assignment would give them. When the train arrived, the people cheered and wept as the wounded were offloaded. By midnight, the crowd was still waiting at the station, just in case another train appeared, though none was scheduled to arrive. After that, wounded constantly arrived from the front in such numbers that after a week all the hospitals in the city were filled up, and the authorities had to call upon civic devotion to find them places to stay. In this week, indifference had already set in the public. No one went to see the wounded arrive, and sometimes these had to sleep in the train station because there was nowhere to send them. There were far too many wounded, and everyone already had their own worries by now, waiting anxiously for news of the fate of their loved ones on the front. Then the first train of German prisoners came. Spirits were overheated due to the reports of supposed German savagery that their newspapers gave them. The people packed the railway crossing, and when the train passed, everyone threatened and insulted the prisoners. Gentlemen brandished their canes while ladies brandished their silk parasols. Others threw stones, and some of the more fanatical pulled out knives and leaped onto the train with the intent of harming the prisoners, but the sentries managed to resist them. Barthas commented in his diary that the Germans had received a fine idea of what southern French hospitality was like with this shameful display. Despite this initial reaction, the hatred of the masses diminished greatly when proof appeared that, Unlike what their newspapers said, the Germans did not massacre all their prisoners and did not leave the French wounded to die. Eventually, rage gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to indifference, and some even started to pity them. Another spectacle at the train station that distracted the crowds was the arrival of an Algerian division filled with Zouaves. The Zouaves are an interesting bit that deserves more attention. The Zouaves had been Berber tribesmen that the French encountered when they conquered Algeria in the 1830s. These tribesmen inspired the creation of Zouave units that, by the middle of the 19th century, were made up in their entirety by European colonists from French North Africa. As can be seen in the picture, they wore rather peculiar uniforms that were different from the standard French infantry uniform of that time. The recently arrived Zouaves inspired admiration both in the soldiers and civilians of Narbonne, with their unique look, their parades, their marches, and their proud bearing. The French soldiers also felt quite jealous of the Zouaves' uniforms, which were so well maintained and eye-catching, while they only had their ragged and misfitting clothing. One unpleasant thing that the Zouaves brought with them was their colonel, who inspired fear in the Zouaves as well as in the Narbonne garrison. This was a man that punished his men for any mistake and demanded to always be saluted, no matter the distance. One day Barthas was walking with some of his comrades along the beautiful Promenade des Barracks of Narbonne, when the colonel, whom they hadn't noticed, bounded towards them from across the avenue, furious that they hadn't saluted him. The scared soldiers tried to explain to him that they had not seen him, but the colonel said he would punish them for their lack of respect, though in the end it seems he forgot, because neither Barthas nor his comrades suffered consequences in the end. Others were far less lucky. One day the Zouaves headed to the fields outside the city for maneuvers, and the soldiers that stayed inside the city gates were so far away that they thought they were exempt from the obligation of saluting the colonel. But the colonel noticed this from atop his horse, so he rode towards them, took the soldiers' names, and sentenced each of them to 6 days in prison. Eventually, a few days after their arrival, the Zouaves and their colonel embarked for the front. The Narbonne soldiers pitied the Zouaves for being led to battle by such a brute, and Barthas wondered how many would be lucky enough to return to their homes in Algeria. The last event worthy of attention in Narbonne that Barthas recounts in this notebook is the passage through the town of an army of Hindus who had landed at Marseille. These were part of the Indian units of the British Army, which was allied to France. Something that piqued Barthas's curiosity was the level of security and surveillance measures that were put in place along the railway line and in the railway station. Guards were posted everywhere, with strict orders to not allow any civilians to enter the station. Barthas later learned that these measures were apparently put in place to prevent gawkers from making fun of the costumes, habits, and prayers of the Hindus. Barthas thought that the Hindus were quite peculiar. He describes that their favorite food was goat meat, and they slaughtered the animals themselves at the station, but only after their priests blessed the animals. Barthas also comments that the Indian soldiers ate certain grains which he tasted out of curiosity, but seemed to have no flavor to speak of. At the end of their meal, the Hindus lit a big pipe that could have been called the squad's pipe. For in each group, every man took a few puffs from the pipe and then passed it along to his neighbor. But eventually, Barthas's garrison duty in Narbonne came to an end when on the 2nd of October he was assigned to a detachment of 25 men that had orders to escort a train with German prisoners from the Narbonne station to Mont Louis, a small village in the Pyrenees with an enormous fortress that had been built in the 17th century and that was now used to house prisoners of war. After escorting the prisoners, they would stay in Mont Louis as prison guards. At these news, the soldiers in the detachment left the convent and its fleas with no regrets. The prisoner train was due to arrive at 5 in the morning, and Barthas says that tons of preparations were made, with guards posted everywhere and the civilians chased off, as if they expected a trainload full of dangerous cannibals. When the train arrived, the soldiers entered in groups of 6 into the carloads of prisoners, with bayonets fixed and rifles loaded. The Germans were seated on benches running along the sides of each freight car, while the soldiers sat on planks in the middle. The prisoners were silent, peaceful, and even smiled at their guards. Then the train departed. Early during the trip, one of the prisoners started singing the Marseillaise without the slightest accent, to the surprise of the French guards. It turned out the man was from Alsace-Lorraine. For those who do not know, here is a little context. Alsace-Lorraine was a region that was annexed by the German Empire in 1871 after its victory over France. It has had a tumultuous history, with both Germany and France claiming it as their own, and has been influenced by the culture and language of both nations. By the start of the First World War in 1914, it was still part of the German Empire, so many Alsatian men had to fight in the German army. Now returning to the story. The Alsatian prisoner who could speak French fluently soon joined the soldiers' conversation and served as an interpreter. The guards also shared their meals, which were more substantial than the ones the prisoners received, with the Alsatian. Their journey by train continued, and for a while it took a turn for the Majestic. The train rode alongside the Mediterranean at precisely the moment the sun was rising from among the waves and made the sea shine and sparkle. The German prisoners leaned towards the open door of the freight car to take in the awe-inspiring view, and the French guards were filled with pride at the prisoners' admiration of their blue sea. Soon after, they passed through an area which was filled to the brim with all kinds of game: quail, rabbits, guinea fowl, among many others. These animals were frightened by the passing of the train and fled in all directions, flooding the countryside. All aboard the train admired this spectacle of nature. These shared experiences created a truce between the guards and the captives. The Germans started chatting among themselves in low voices, and some hummed and sang. In his diary, Barthas wrote that he considered that the prisoners' songs were evidence that God had created 2 types of larynx, one for the French and one for the Germans. There was one unpleasant incident during the journey when the train stopped at the station of Sals. A Marine infantry non-commissioned officer climbed the step of their car, gave a quick look around, and then grabbed a German's distinctive baker's cap with the intention to steal it. Barthas told him to stop, but a mere territorial corporal had no authority over a non-com from a colonial regiment. The German tried to defend himself, but the officer punched him 3 times in the face and ran off with the cap. Barthas asked his lieutenant for help, and they searched the entire town, but the thief had vanished. The German prisoner that had suffered the theft wept with anger and regret. It seemed the baker's cap had been extremely important for him. One of the French guards gave the prisoner his own cap as a gift. The prisoner refused it disdainfully at the beginning, but in the end he accepted it, more as a duty than in goodwill. After that, the journey by train continued. At one of the last stages, they passed through the region of Roussillon, in the southernmost part of France. There was a newspaper there that was famous for its jingoism. It inflamed the hatred of the population and described the Germans as nothing more than monsters that wore human faces. This particular newspaper had learned the date of the passage of their train and had announced to its readers that it was their patriotic duty to come to shout and harass the German prisoners. So after they entered Roussillon, at each level crossing and at each station, there was a furious crowd waiting for them. The crowds shouted and cursed at the prisoners, and Barthas comments that the women were the most extreme in their demonstrations of hatred, with some trying to climb into the cars to spit on the prisoners, and others threatening the Germans with knives, clubs, and stones. Their behavior towards the French guards was the polar opposite. They cheered at them and gave them fruits and good wine from the region, while specifying that they should not give any of it, to what they simply called those German murderers. Despite these instructions, the moment the train left, the guards wasted no time sharing all of it with the prisoners, and this camaraderie made up for all the demonstrations. At the commune of Prades, the crowd extended along both sides of the track. The cars were opened only on one side, but the other half of the crowd protested so loudly that it was necessary to open the doors on both sides to prevent incidents, which made the guards' duty all the more difficult, having to fend off furious waves of predominantly female patriots on both sides. Eventually, the train stopped at the station of Villefranche-de-Conflans, and they had to change to an electric railroad that climbed up into the Pyrenees and reached the Spanish frontier. Barthas comments that the railroad had been built recently, but it had been inaugurated in the most tragic of fashions. The engineers that built the train, together with other important people involved in the project, took the very first ride coming down the Pyrenees to celebrate their achievement. But the brakes failed and the train jumped the tracks, falling down a precipice and claiming the lives of nearly all its passengers. To Barthas it was as if the mountain had claimed its revenge for being conquered by man. As this train with such a tragic past climbed the mountains, the guards and prisoners were filled with fear, vertigo, and awe. The sight was majestic, and there were no more angry crowds waiting for them. The villages were few and far between, and were populated by nothing more than peaceful shepherds and woodcutters. At noon, they got off at the station of La Cabanaise, which served the village of Mont Louis, and finally reached their destination. The fortress of Mont Louis was impressive, with a first ring of walls that encircled the entire village of about 1,000 inhabitants, and a second ring of walls that surrounded the barracks, magazines, and other military structures. Here was also where the prisoners were housed. A few days before the arrival of Barthas's detachment, the town had suffered a serious incident. By decision of High Command, a lot of what the soldiers called joyeux had been assembled at Mont Louis for mobilization. These joyeux were reservists assigned to disciplinary battalions in French African Army units. For reasons unknown to Barthas, soon after these disciplinary units arrived, they mutinied and started pillaging and vandalizing all they could. They burst through the fortress gates and terrorized the villagers. It was necessary to send a detachment of troops from Perpignan to re-establish order. The mutineers were all sent back to Africa, being refused the honor of going to the front to fight and die for their country. Though Barthas wasn't sure whether the joyeux felt humiliated or relieved by this. When Barthas's detachment arrived, the results of the looting could still be seen. One of the more heartbreaking things they saw was how brutally the mutineers had broken into the lockers of the young soldiers from the garrison, that had packed them hastily with their personal belongings before having to go to the front. Anything of value had disappeared, and all the letters, mementos, and photographs laid scattered and trampled on the floor of the fortress. At this sad sight, Barthas said that the Boches were treated as barbarians and bandits every day in our newspapers, but they were lambs compared to our terrible zephyrs from Africa. At the fort of Mont Louis, there were only 100 guards to watch over 600 prisoners, and the Spanish frontier was only about 12 kilometers away. During the day, the Germans moved freely throughout the courtyards of the fort, and it would have been simple for them to overpower the guards and escape towards the frontier, where there was nothing except a few customs agents that stood guard for smugglers, not prisoners of war. Despite this, the German prisoners were quite docile, and there was no incident on their part during Barthas's stay. According to Barthas, the prisoners did not have much to complain about. They had good conditions and were fed about the same as the guards. Despite this, some did not seem satisfied and were constantly hunting for scraps and the guards' leftovers. Some of the guards amused themselves rather cruelly by throwing pieces of bread out of the windows and into the mud, where several pairs of hands would immediately start fighting and grappling to seize them. There were 10 or so prisoners that came from Alsace-Lorraine and could speak French more or less fluently. One day they were introduced to a general that had come on an inspection tour. This general thought it would be a great idea to offer them to serve in the French army, thinking that they could not refuse the honor. The prisoners grimaced and denied the offer, explaining that if they joined the French army, then they would not be able to return to their homes and families once the war ended. The general was furious at this denial and threatened them all with punishment, saying that they were nothing but Boches, and so they would be treated as such. Despite this general's threats, nothing was done to the prisoners in the end because of the valuable service they provided to the prison as interpreters. To keep the prisoners busy, the prison authorities had them carry out military drills, exercises, and war games. Barthas thought that it would have been far better to make the prisoners do useful work, but his opinion on the matter was irrelevant. The prisoners' maneuvers in those drills were far superior to that of the guards. All their movements were automatic and precise. In contrast, the guards' drills and movements were so awkward that their captain made them assemble behind a building which blocked the prisoners' view to avoid their mockery. This forced the guards to drill outside the fortress, exposed to the snows and cold winds of the mountains. As a side note, one of the curious things that Barthas notes in his diary from these times, when the war was young and enthusiasm for it so high, was that the French who lived in Spain rushed across the border so they could enlist and fight in the French army. Another aspect of life in Mont Louis was that on Sundays their bosses gave the guards leave to go spend the day in Puigcerdà, the capital of Spanish Cerdagne and the first Spanish locale across the border. This was an incredible amount of freedom for the regular soldier, and they enjoyed it deeply. At the customs post, the Spanish soldiers simply asked the French to leave their bayonets there while they stayed in Spain. They could pick them up when they returned. Puigcerdà was very pretty, and the guards could eat well at the Posada d'Aragon. One thing that shocked the French greatly was how happy the Spanish town was. There was music and dance parties everywhere, and everyone seemed to have fun. Back on their side, there was no longer music or fun in the French towns. The war had consumed all facets of life. On one of these Sunday leaves, Barthas struck a conversation, half in French and half in Spanish, with a local at the Posada d'Aragon. Barthas asked this man what he thought about the war, and the Spaniard answered simply that there was one thing that confused him. "When there's war in Spain," he said, "everybody who can get away heads for France, but the French do exactly the opposite. When there's war in France, all the French that live in Spain rush to go and fight." This left a deep impression in Barthas, but he would not see Puigcerdà or this man again, for his departure from Mont Louis was near. But before leaving the fortress of Mont Louis, there was one last thing that Barthas wished to talk about, and that was the major, the medical officer in Mont Louis. This was a cruel doctor that hated Germans and never missed an opportunity to mistreat and torture the prisoners that were supposedly in his care. For example, one day he found a container of cod liver oil that had gone rancid, abandoned in an infirmary locker. This rancid oil was administered copiously and generously to all prisoners that presented themselves at sickbay, and their grimaces brought joy and laughter to the major and his staff. Another day they vaccinated the prisoners against smallpox, and the major enjoyed wielding his scalpel liberally and cruelly. Those prisoners that did not faint right away from the pain screamed and squealed as if their throats had been cut. There was another instance that happened while Barthas was present at sickbay. A German prisoner arrived with a badly swollen cheek, so the major took his pliers and scalpels and went to work on his jaws and molars. The unlucky man ran away screaming in terror, but the major simply burst into laughter and ordered the guards to seize the German and haul him back. Then the major proceeded to work on the prisoner's jaw, with care as tender as one can imagine. Another incident happened at night when Barthas was on guard duty with 4 other men. The prisoners called out to him, saying that one of their comrades was very sick. When the guards entered, they saw a dozen Germans grouped around the sick man, on whom they had pulled all their blankets to keep him warm. They begged them to go find the major, saying Herr Doctor to try and make themselves understood. Barthas rushed off to find help, and 5 minutes later found the medical staff corporal Edouard Durand, a good man that came from Peyriac Minerva, just like Barthas. When the situation was explained to him, Durand ran off to find the major, even though he knew that this would only get him in trouble. Predictably, the major told them that he would not get out of bed for a Boche, and that if the prisoner croaked, all that was needed was for them to haul his carcass to the dung heap. Durand had more humanity and did what little he could. He went back to the infirmary and brewed a cup of tea that was brought to the sick man. 3 or 4 days later, the prisoner died in the infirmary, where he had finally been accepted, but far too late to do any good. And so this is a bit of the story of the doctor, who had a duty and an oath to care for the sick and wounded, but who could not get over his prejudice and his hatred. It is impossible to know how much harm he and other people like him caused on innocent victims throughout the war. Meanwhile, beyond Mont Louis, the war was still being fought, with so many casualties being suffered every day that the reserve classes had to be called up. During Barthas' stay in Mont Louis, the garrison towns started emptying rapidly. Eventually, at the end of October, the 2 youngest reserves of the Territorial Army, one of which Barthas belonged to, were assigned to leave for the front to reinforce the 80th and 280th regiments from Narbonne, which had been decimated. On the 30th of October, 1914, Barthas and 29 other territorials left Mont Louis to rejoin their depot at Narbonne. Their spirits were low and the weather foul. The ground was covered in snow, the wind was cold, and the storm shrouded the mountains in fog. At noon they departed on a path that had been shoveled by the prisoners. As they passed by, these prisoners stood at the side and saluted all of them. For a moment, the poilus thought that it was derision or mockery, but when they looked at the prisoners' faces, they saw they were grave. They were saluting them because they knew what was waiting for them. They were gladiators that were entering the arena to suffer and die in a hell that the German prisoners had already experienced. Their captain accompanied them to the station at La Cabanaise, but his haughty attitude and his coldness when dealing with the soldiers had made it so that he didn't have their sympathy. He gave an empty speech that did not comfort the soldiers and then left. The soldiers boarded the train and departed. At 8 in the evening, they reached Perpignan. In this part of France, there was no snow yet. Barthas' attention was caught by an enormous crowd that jammed the square and adjacent streets. From time to time, one could hear applause, cries of anger, and sometimes mad laughter coming from the crowd. When Barthas approached, he saw that they were outside the office of that jingoistic newspaper that had previously organized the attacks on their prisoner train during its passing through the area. Every 10 minutes, they projected on a screen on the building's facade the headlines which would appear on the newspaper the next day. Everything was blown up for the sake of drama, and despite the deteriorating situation on the front, the newspaper presented it as excellent. Victory was certain and near. The people were getting their heads stuffed with nonsense. Another, more pleasant thing that the soldiers found at Perpignan was a billboard announcing that soldiers passing through the city could get free wine as a gift from some of the most famous wine growers in the region. the poilus immediately took advantage of this opportunity. After that, they resumed their journey and left Perpignan. On the next day, October 31st, at 3 a.m., they arrived at the Mont Louis barracks in Narbonne. Manival certainly knew of their arrival because it was on his orders that they had come. But the authorities had not been alerted and no preparations were made to receive them. The soldiers simply wished for a mug of hot coffee and a comfortable spot to sleep after their journey, but even this was denied to them. They had to seek and wake up the battalion adjutant, a bad-tempered man that was furious at being disturbed. He had the buglers on duty call out all 8 company sergeants in the depot, without a care in the world for disturbing the sleep of the rest of the barracks. The NCOs, rather predictably, did not give the soldiers a warm welcome. The adjutant split the soldiers haphazardly to each NCO and left. Barthas and 3 other comrades were led into a billet that was already full of sleepers lying on scraps of straw. They spent the night there surrounded by the ticks, fleas and lice that were so abundant in the barracks. On the 1st of November at 5 in the afternoon, 700 men from the first 3 classes of the Territorial Army left for the front to rejoin the battered 280th Active Reserve Infantry Regiment. Much like those 700 men, Barthas and his comrades were set to leave for the front on Wednesday, 4th of November. On Saturday, they asked the authorities for 24-hour furloughs so they could go home and spend time with their families. But they were denied this under the pretext that Sunday furlough requests had to be submitted to Manival by no later than the Thursday before. Barthas wrote that even condemned men were granted the opportunity to see their loved ones one last time, but they were denied even that, perhaps so they wouldn't grow soft right when they were to head out for the front. This denial from the authorities did not discourage some of the soldiers, and the notebook ends with Barthas and 2 other comrades escaping Narbonne on foot and taking a train at the next station in the nearby town of Marcorignan to visit his family and spend the Sunday with them before having to leave for the front. And so, this is the end of the first notebook. On the next episode of this series, we shall take a look at the second notebook and the departure of Barthas for the front and the miseries of the trenches. I hope to see you there. Until next time.